Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I'm your host, Danny Namberg. Every Monday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we are interviewing food and agriculture business leaders about how their companies are hopefully changing for the better. Today, I get to chat with Sam Fulton, the Nomad Foods Group Director of Corporate Affairs. Nomad Foods is Europe's largest frozen foods company. The company has launched a bunch of sustainability efforts and initiatives and will soon launch a partnership with the World Wildlife Fund. Sam herself has more than 20 years of experience in communications, sustainability, and advocacy roles for some of the world's largest food and consumer goods companies. Thanks so much for being here, Sam. You're joining us from the UK.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for taking a part of your evening with us. I appreciate it.
No
So
problem.
for a lot of Americans, they might not have heard of Nomad. Can you explain the company a little bit?
Yeah, so we're basically listed in New York, but headquartered in the UK. And as you explained, we're Europe's largest frozen food company. What that basically means is we've got brands that include Bird's Eye, Findus, Igloo, and in the markets that we're actually active, these are probably number one, number two brands across most of the markets. We're active and operational. We manufacture in 14 different markets. That includes places like the UK, France, Germany, Spain, for example. And yeah, really very much focused on frozen. Frozen is all that we actually do, and we're very very proud that these brands are genuinely at the heart of family life. They've been at the heart of family life for decades. So very much like well loved, well kind of like recognized brands in Europe.
I feel like Frozen is having its moment, maybe for the last 5 years, but certainly during the pandemic, because when I was growing up, frozen food was kind of looked down upon. You didn't want to eat fish sticks or those kinds of things. And now there's this whole sort of revolution, I think, maybe because people are seeing the nutritional quality that can come about when you freeze things in the right way. And
Yeah,
maybe because the pandemic has sort of taught us to, it's great to have a supply of ready to eat food on hand.
yeah. I mean, I think actually both of those things are reasons that people are either rediscovering or staying with frozen. So if you look at the pandemic specifically, clearly people are shopping less. They're maybe having to shop, bigger shops, when they actually go out. And obviously frozen doesn't go off. You can use it for a long time. So lots of people have actually rediscovered frozen food during the pandemic. And a lot of our research actually shows that, millennials in particular, because actually they're rediscovering frozen, they're seeing new products such as plant protein, for example. They're genuinely coming into the category and they're staying in it because they like what they see. The food is highly nutritious, it's really convenient, and it has other benefits, including less food waste, for example. So from a sustainability point of view, frozen actually also indexes really well. And then in terms of our wider portfolio, I mean, we very much have a portfolio at Nomad that's flexitarian at heart. It's based on fish, veg, and potatoes. About 70% of our portfolio is made up of those food items. So, we genuinely feel that we're kind of like in the right position to be supporting people who want to eat sustainably. And because we do have mass brands, we're also really proud of the fact that that means that we can actually help millions of people to make small changes every day, really. So, big brands available for millions of people that are affordable and available and sustainably sourced. That's our big kind of focus.
Sure. You mentioned two things. One is nutritious foods that you're trying to provide to
Yeah.
people. How are frozen foods more nutritious than sometimes than fresh
Yeah.
foods?
Yeah, I mean, most frozen foods are frozen very quickly. So, in terms of locking in nutrients, there are good examples on things like frozen peas, for example. So our frozen peas are actually frozen about 2.5 hours after they're actually harvested, which is really, really fast. Um, there are lots of benefits in terms of frozen veg, for example. You can use it out of season because the flavor
Mhm.
and the nutrition is actually locked in. But even in terms of our broader portfolio, about 90% of our portfolio actually indexes as healthier meal choices. So we use an independently recognized nutrition profiling tool. And we want to make sure actually that we've got a really good balance of both nutrition, but also so foods that are good for you, good for your health, but also are actually better for the planet as well, really.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, nutrition is a really big attribute of frozen. Clearly, there are also more indulgent products, but even those where we're renovating, removing fat, sugar, etc.,
Sure.
adding fiber. There are lots more vegan options. So there's always room for indulgence, but the predominantly our portfolio is made up of really healthy meal choices, actually.
And the other thing you mentioned was less food waste. How does freezing prevent food waste?
There are several reasons. So one is a lot of frozen food is actually portioned. So it will actually be in one portion that you eat, or say in the case of stuff like fish fingers, it will be actually in a box or a package that you'd use some of it and then you can keep it. So the first thing is actually it's designed to be portioned really. So that's really convenient. There's less food wasted again, just in terms of the food doesn't go off. Obviously, it keeps for weeks and months. You can go back to it. It's always there. So a lot of it comes from that. And then in terms of production, for us in particular, like just looking at really efficient production, because these are big brands that are mass produced in factories, then you can get a lot of efficiencies through that really. So but both through the way the food is produced and then also how it's used in the home, there's a lot of opportunity to actually reduce food waste, because unlike fresh or like fresh vegetables, for example, they don't go off and the nutrition stays, it's locked in.
Yeah, we don't talk about that enough, I think, in the food waste world, about how having frozen food on hand can be helpful. Do you think once the pandemic is over and we're on the other side of this, that we'll go back to what I like to call the cult of fresh, where we're obsessed with? I love fresh fruits and vegetables. I also like frozen, but that we'll go back to this cult of fresh that we had prior to the pandemic?
Um, I mean, I can't talk about the rest of the industry. I mean, we're actually quite an interesting company in the sense that, if you listen to our CEO in terms of our financials, we were actually growing before the pandemic. We've continued to grow through the pandemic, and actually we're predicting growth this year and beyond. So we're very much seeing actually people rediscovering frozen, and based on what we're seeing in terms of consumer research, it definitely looks like it's a trend that's going to stay. Um, I think you can assume as there is more interest in what we would describe as eating for the planet, there's likely to be more interest in frozen as part of people's repertoire. I mean, it's not saying that they won't continue to use fresh, but actually there's a genuine renaissance in frozen where people are actually realizing the benefits and
Sure.
enjoying it. And then if they're interested in kind of eating more sustainably, they're seeing that there are sustainability benefits as well.
Interesting. I remember several years ago, I was at a seafood expo in Boston, and I was with people like Chef Barton Seaver, who is a seafood expert, and all of these members of sort of the seafood industry, and how important frozen fish is to the world in terms of providing protein. But there are some problems around sustainability in the fishing industry, and also transparency and traceability. And I was reading on your website that you want both fish sustainable practices and sustainable farming practices for vegetables in place by the end of 2025. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering what sustainable, how Nomad defines sustainable and really what that means.
Yeah. So our target, as you said, is basically 100% fish and seafood to be sourced sustainably by 2025. And for us, that basically means certified. So MSC certified Marine Stewardship Council, or ASC certified, which is the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. About 96% of our portfolio currently is MSC certified. And in fact, we're already the world's largest purchaser of MSC certified white fish. We were one of the founders of the MSC. So it's something, fish is the biggest part of our business. So this is something that's really material to us to make sure that we actually do a really good job in terms of sourcing sustainably. Obviously, things continue to evolve. So actually, we work really closely with MSC and other partners to make sure that what we're doing actually continues to evolve as much as anything. But we fundamentally believe that certification is one really key way to make sure that we can guarantee future fish stocks, and actually we can also educate consumers about where their fish is from. So we do a lot of consumer communication. In fact, there's a new campaign to actually help consumers, like use things like QR codes so that they can actually trace where the fish actually came from. So it's as much about making sure that we've traced our supply chain and along with MSC, as much as it is trying to engage consumers in that kind of journey and the story around where their fish is actually coming from.
And on the vegetable side, how do you ensure that sustainable farming practices are in place?
So similarly, we have a 100% target. So basically, fish and veg are the two biggest parts of our portfolio. In terms of vegetables, the target is for all of our vegetables and potatoes to be sustainably sourced by 2025. Where we start from is basically a framework, and the framework is based on the SCI platform, Farm Sustainability Assessment. we basically want to make sure that all of our suppliers are minimum silver level FSA and progressing towards gold, because that's a much higher standard. Currently, about 70%, 77% of our actual own sourced vegetables are at silver. We expect to be at about 70% gold by year end. And we've also got really significant parts of our veg supply chain that are already at FSA gold. So our Bird's Eye Pea supply chain team actually were one of the first farm management teams to be FSA verified as gold, and that was last year. But that's actually really why we've just announced the partnership with WWF. So it's really designed to build on this foundation of FSA and then start to take it to another level and focus much more on things like biodiversity, where again we've done a lot and we've got good case studies from the past few years, but we believe we can actually do more and really build on that and take it to another level.
And are you able to incentivize farmers to do this through different pricing structures?
Pricing's really only one part of it. I mean, these are a lot of these are farmers that we've worked with for literally decades. So that it's very much a kind of joint partnership. So price is part of the equation, but a lot of it is actually about that there are additional benefits for them if they can actually supply sustainably. So sometimes they can save money. Obviously they can potentially increase their yield. So a lot of the work with WWF, for example, is looking at what are the nature positive ways of farming where you could also increase productivity at the same time as you can actually benefit biodiversity. So it's not kind of like an either or. So that there's a real benefit in us having that long relationship, but a benefit for them as well in terms of this constantly evolving innovation really that we're able to partner with them on. So sometimes it will be partnering with experts such as universities. In the current case, it's partnering with WWF to bring their knowledge and their relationships to really, as I said, like take what we know and our farmers know and kind of take it up a level.
That's exciting. Nomad says that it wants to show how agriculture can meet the triple challenge of feeding a growing population, tackling the climate crisis, and reversing biodiversity loss. And I've seen many companies make statements like this. This is a very ambitious one. Why do you think Nomad has a responsibility to do this?
Well, I think in vegetables particularly, we've got a long heritage. Also, if you look at our supply chain, I mean, every food company will say the same thing. We need to make sure that we've got resilient agricultural supply chains if we want to guarantee the future supply. I mean, we have brands that are expanding. They're brands that have been around for decades. We want to make sure that they're favorites for years to come. So it's really important for us to actually invest in those supply chains. And I think there's a realization that on our own, we're actually not able to do this. We've done a lot. We already have a lot of partnerships, but we genuinely need some of the knowledge and the input from organizations like WWF so that we can actually not just kind of like improve our supply chain, but obviously go beyond our supply chain really. So that this is very much about starting focus. So the initial focus is on a blueprint for landscapes, really to look at how we can actually, as I said, increase productivity at the same time as we can increase biodiversity. And then the second part of the kind of the first stage is to really look at how can we actually measure biodiversity at farm level so that we can then start to look at what are the best interventions, what are the things that will actually genuinely improve biodiversity. How can we increase pollinators, for example, on farms, really right down to farm level. Because I'm sure actually measuring biodiversity is one of the big challenges. So that's why part of it is actually looking at quite a data-driven approach to really being able to do that. So that's where we start. And then once we've started on that journey, then we'll start to look at other things really. But the partnership literally just launched last week, so it's very much the beginning.
That's great. And can we take a step back and talk about how that came about? How did that partnership come about?
So I can't claim any credit. So I actually joined Nomad about 7 months ago. So this is a partnership that's been in discussion for much, much longer. Really, mostly us trying to identify, what would be a next evolution. How do we go from actually a very good foundation and actually build on that, and then also trying to map like what were the actually really big issues and challenges that we can see ahead of us or actually currently related to our supply chain. So in terms of veg, obviously biodiversity loss is huge. It's increasing at an exponential rate. We believe as a company that's known for our vegetables that we need to actually take action. So there was a real motivation to then identify who the right partner could be. WWF is obviously known as one of the world's largest protectors of biodiversity. So in many ways, it felt like a perfect partnership. But there have been a lot of teams, our agriculture team, sustainability experts in our business who've spent a lot of time with WWF trying to work out what would be something that both of us can actually stand behind and be really proud of, actually.
And I was interested to read that you want, a lot of cross-sector collaboration. So it's not just farmers, it's not just your company,
Yeah.
it's not just, an organization like WWF. It's involving, other companies, policymakers, sort of unusual suspects in this whole chain.
Yeah. And in some ways, that's part of the power of WWF. I mean, they've got real power in terms of being able to convene, these multi-stakeholder programs. We can bring a lot of knowledge. As I said, there are universities and different partners that we've worked with. There are obviously expert partners that they work with. But the idea really is to combine that and, hopefully really start to identify what we can do on our own and then where we may need to partner with other organizations. Part of it for Nomad actually is being more vocal in terms of, with governments. We've tended to be fairly under the radar. Our brands are very famous, but actually the company's not that well known. So this is also part of us
Sure.
being more active, really, in areas that are material to our business. So, but we very much recognise that, actually that's one of the reasons we're working with WWF, because they actually have this huge power and, to bring people together to solve problems, really.
No, and I know because of their reputation, we love them. Food Tank loves them. It gets away from the fear that I think, other companies might have around greenwashing or saying things that
Yeah.
aren't, necessarily happening.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of this is about driving action. The other key thing is actually about, again, engaging consumers in the journey. So part of the partnership is we actually will do on-pack messaging. The idea is to really help consumers understand, first of all, what we do already, but also what the partnership is trying to achieve. So the fact that we are trying to, in a very simple way, protect birds, bees, and butterflies, really. And then as we continue, then there'll be further communication, not just on pack, but on our websites, really. So that this is in many ways a bit of a, it's an extension of our existing messaging to make sure that consumers really know,
Sure.
how we are working, for the future, and how they can be reassured that their veg is actually sourced sustainably. So the consumer engagement piece is really, really key as well. We know they're interested, but they also want, there's a lot of feedback that consumers want it to be really simple and affordable. So that's what we need to make sure that we continue to deliver is, affordable, sustainably sourced food that's actually really convenient and easy for them to use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like so many of your foods in Europe are really, they're not just affordable, they're accessible, they're everywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
And that makes a
And
big
I mean,
difference.
yeah, I mean that's really our business model. I mean, our brands are literally on every high street. A lot of our partners are international retailers. Through the pandemic, things like e-commerce have actually, increased massively. So that ability to access we see as actually one of our kind of like real kind of strengths, really, where we don't have niche brands that that only rich people can buy. We've got brands that genuinely everybody can afford.
Sure.
And our view very much is that if we want to help people to be eating sustainably, you've got to make sure that it's actually affordable. I think there was a GlobeScan report last year, I think, actually reinforced that, where even though consumers want to eat sustainably, they genuinely don't feel that they can often pay more for it. So we need to make sure that it's actually at the right price as much as anything.
Absolutely. Going back to sort of the environmental sustainability aspects of the company, refrigeration and freezing are obviously very energy intensive. And I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the efforts to reduce that impact, or especially around carbon emissions and transport as well.
Yeah. So in terms of how we actually produce the food, so we obviously have carbon reduction targets. We've signed up to SBTI, and actually this year we'll actually submit
Can you
our
explain what that
proposals.
is for our listeners? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so that's actually basically the God, I can't even remember what it's called now.
Sustainable. It's okay. We can move on from there. That's okay.
Yeah, it's basically like to reduce carbon, to make sure that within the 1.5%. I can't believe I forgot that acronym.
That's all right. No problem.
But basically, we alongside other companies are a signatory to that, and then basically what we need to do now is submit a proposal to make sure that we actually show how we are actually going to reduce
Right.
carbon in line with the 1.5 degrees target, really. It's the Science-Based Target Initiative. Sorry, I knew I would get it eventually.
Thank you.
So we're signed up to that, and then obviously to make that happen, we have various things in place. So making sure that we're using more green electricity. So we have targets against that. In terms of other stuff, like making sure that we're actually trying to measure the full impact of our product. So even though it's early days, we have actually done some early stage LCAs to look into exactly that, almost like, what are the major contributors to carbon, especially in terms of our products, not just production, but right through to how consumers actually use them. And even though this is not published yet, there are some really interesting things coming through around. Actually, the most intense part is probably the consumer actually cooking the product. And if you compare, for example, frozen peas with other kind of like methods such as canning, because again, these are quite energy intensive. Actually, frozen looks pretty good, and in fact, it comes off better than you might expect. So some of these LCAs we're actually doing more work on, but these are the kind of things that we hope to publish at some point. We've very much kind of like started to put them through in terms of like the much more detailed analysis, really. But the initial results are actually quite interesting, because exactly to your point, we want to investigate like what the contribution of freezing is,
Right.
and actually is that worse, as it were, than some of the other preservation methods.
And I just for our listeners again, LCAs are life cycle analyses, right?
Yeah. So basically to measure like the kind of, I suppose, the carbon footprint of a food stuff, really. It's quite a complicated process. I mean, I know in the States you've also got labeling. There are various labels here, but it's something that that most consumers probably aren't that engaged in the detail, but
Sure.
they are interested in this idea of knowing the contribution to carbon of their particular food.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's kind of a fine line of how much information you can give consumers before they get completely overwhelmed. I mean, I've done, I know a lot about these things and I get overwhelmed if I'm at the grocery store and see a ton of labels.
Yeah, and there are different methodologies. One of the challenges, there's actually not a standard methodology, but that's definitely something that we're looking at, partly because there is some consumer interest actually in that. So that may be something that we'll do more of in the future.
When you mentioned millennials before and Gen Y and Gen Z, they're going to have more of an interest in sort of knowing the story of their food in so many ways.
Yeah. And I mean, as I said, like if you look at the pandemic, there's partly because green cuisine is our big meat-free plant protein brand. That's definitely been a driver of millennials into the category. Clearly that's at the sweet spot of several trends. I mean, it's frozen, so it's got the benefits of frozen, but also it's part of the kind of like the plant-based food revolution. And increasingly, as you say, I mean, we very much feel we're at the point where there will be a generational change in diet, and that's partly why we're starting to do much more around sustainable eating, really to look at how our portfolio actually matches up to what you would consider to be a sustainable diet. We've actually commissioned specific research to look at how you can actually model ways of eating to look at their impact on carbon footprint. We've tried to model that against dietary recommendations. So as an example, in Europe, for example, there's a recommendation to eat 2 portions of sustainably sourced fish, to increase veg consumption to 300 grams a day, and to eat more plant protein. And we've actually modeled, if you did that, you could reduce your carbon emissions from food by up to 60%. That is actually a really good match for our portfolio because it's fish and veg heavy. And then if you then add the extra benefits of frozen, such as reductions in food waste, you potentially could reduce your carbon footprint even further. So there's some really interesting work actually, not just that we've done, but that there are like very famous reports like Eat Lancet, for example, that really looked at this kind of the kind of sweet spot between food that's healthy for you and then also good for the planet at the same time.
Absolutely. And other organizations and institutions are really looking at that as well. Can you talk about how you handle packaging?
Yeah, so we've got a target for 100% of packaging to be recyclable by end of 2022. Currently, I think we're about 83%. One of the challenges actually is the fact that there are regulations around using recycled plastic, for example, in certain kind of foodstuffs, for example. So there are some restrictions around what we can actually do, but a lot of our packaging is actually cardboard already. There are other packaging for peas, for example, that's plastic. So we've just actually done some big renovations to make sure that some of those packaging, especially on the bigger SKUs, are actually fully recyclable. But that's something that we're definitely very active on, and actually it's an area that continues to evolve.
Sure.
So as it continues to evolve, for example, we have a futures team, and one of the things that they're continually looking at is packaging as part of that actual work that they're doing in terms of not just what can we do now, but where may things go in the future.
Right. Something every company I feel like is struggling with in a lot of ways, or at least they should be. They should be thinking about it. I want to talk about Nomad's Sustainable Landscapes Humber project. And if you could talk a little bit about what happened during that project and if it's really scalable.
Yeah, so the Humber, for people who don't know, it's an area in the north of England. It's very good for growing peas because of the climate. It's also susceptible to flooding just because of where it's actually located in the country. And we're actually part of a partnership with Yorkshire Water, who are the big water company in the area, and the University of Humber. And basically what the project aimed to look at was how you could actually use cover crops. So in between the pea planting season, how you could use cover crops to actually improve soil health, reduce flooding, and actually reduce carbon emissions. What they actually found, I mean, the project has some pretty spectacular results. So within 90 days, they had saved enough carbon to actually make 400 UK families carbon neutral for a year. They were able to offset, again, because of the carbon capture, they were able to offset the emissions from things like ploughing. So really what that project very quickly started to show was actually that some of these really innovative farming solutions could actually be a real solution to climate change. What we're actually doing now is, so this is now the second year, we're actually increasing the pilot. We're also looking at whether we can actually expand it to other crops such as wheat that we use for some of our other products. But basically, this is a project now that's being used to look at what would the impact be if you could actually scale that. So already it started to show some pretty spectacular results, and there's now investment in year 2 to really investigate the scalability.
Sure.
And what else can be achieved. But it's something that we're very proud of, and it was a really strong collaboration. Again, linked to some of our farmers that we've worked with for many years.
Yeah, that's great. And it's great. I mean, I should have mentioned this before. I think it's great that you've had relationships with farmers for so many years, because it helps those farmers feel confident that they'll always have a market. You can collect data, you can build those long-term relationships to do something like this Sustainable Landscapes project. And I think that's a really interesting thing that, a lot of companies who sort of don't have those long-term relationships, they really can't do.
Yeah, and about half of our produce comes from farmers that we've got very long relationships and actual partnerships and collaborations with. Clearly, some of it is bought through other suppliers, but even those suppliers are very carefully chosen. But it's a definite advantage. I mean, even some of the other things we've done on biodiversity, again, are testament to the relationship with farmers. So UK, about a third of our farmers have got biodiversity plans. In Germany, for example, for over 15 years, we've done things like plant flower corridors to make sure that we can increase biodiversity around the spinach fields, for example. So really strong examples of ideas that sometimes have come from us or sometimes have actually come from the farmers, but actually years of collaboration and learning, really. And real pride, I think, on both sides that that we are continuing to work together.
Absolutely. Pride and partnership. Those are really key, and something that I think a lot of other companies can learn from. Such an interesting discussion, Sam. Thank you so much. My final question for you is, we're hopefully on, the almost on the other side of this pandemic. And I'm wondering, over the last year, is there a book, a podcast, a person who has really kept you going?
I'd like to say yes. I mean, unfortunately, it's probably quite a lot of Netflix, really. I think actually it sounds like a cheesy answer, but probably actually cookery books. I think the upside of actually having more time, especially at weekends, is being able to cook. So I think there's a whole range of cookbooks that I've actually used, mostly Italian. That's actually been quite nice, is kind of just to have more time to experiment and do things that I've not done for quite a long time, really. So yeah. There's probably not a book. Most of the books I actually read are for work, really. But actually, in terms of like personal, I would say cookery books. I've kind of rediscovered some of those.
I love it. That's great. Thank you so much for this discussion. I learned a lot. I hope folks will join me next Monday when I'll be chatting with Keith Knopf, the CEO and president of Rayleigh's Food, at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And this Wednesday, you can join me when I'll be chatting with Soleil Ho and Justin Phillips of the San Francisco Chronicles food podcast, Extra Spicy. Thank you again, Sam. Please stay safe and well.
You too. Thank you. Take care.
You too.